For my signature assignment, I have chosen my second grade resource room students. Currently, these students are working below grade level and really struggle with writing. They have had trouble throughout the year developing ideas and really elaborating and providing more detail. Due to this, I thought that a personal narrative would be the best way to work on some other skills that I would like to focus on within this unit. The personal narrative allows my students to talk about what they know best, which is their own lives. This I have found throughout the year with our journal writing and weekend news can still be difficult, but I believe it will be easier than things such as opinion and informational writing. So to begin this lesson, I'm going to discuss with my students what a personal narrative is. I'm going to compare this to our weekly weekend news and journal writing, that this is just an event that has happened in their lives that they are going to discuss and write about and tell me all about, because I wasn't there when it happened and I would like to hear all about it, and as with the rest of the class. So once we discuss the idea of a personal narrative, I'm going to share the anchor text of Arthur's family vacation. In this story, Arthur is going on vacation with his family, and it discusses some of the events that happened throughout the vacation. While discussing the story, we're going to talk about, while yes, this vacation is one piece of Arthur's life, he could have even zoomed in on just one of these events and really told us a lot of details. So we're going to put what we did in small moments and work on kind of expanding that idea. So after we finish the text, we're going to take some time to brainstorm some other events we could write about besides the vacation. Because my students have a variety of backgrounds, not all of my students have been on really elaborate vacations and have done many things outside of the town they live in. And I would like for my students to understand that a personal narrative does not have to be something elaborate. It can be something small like a birthday party or something you did with your family over the weekend. It does not have to be a vacation or a trip or something like that. It can be something small that they just really want to tell me about. After this, my students will work on developing their ideas in their writer's notebook, and they will write about a few different things they might choose to write about by listing 3 or 4 ideas. This will give them a good sense going into the next lesson about what they might want to write about. So for my second lesson, I'm going to focus on really honing in on one idea that they wrote about in their writer's notebook. So for this lesson, I'm going to begin by modeling. I would like to show my students what it is like to sequence our events and put them in order. Often my students will start writing in their journal, which is very informal, and they kind of jump around and talk about different parts of either their weekend or our journal, and it's not really in order. So I would like to model for my students sequencing my Disney World vacation. I'm also going to point out that I went on vacation for 5 days, and I cannot possibly tell you about everything I did. So I'm going to pick out 1 or 2 things I really enjoyed on one of the days I was there, and just talk about that. So I will sequence my events using words such as first, next, then, and last. This will show my students what I am expecting of them when they go and work on their own. We will then point out the transition words and the order which we should use them. For example, last should not be the first word we use, and first should not be in the middle. We will point out the order of the words and discuss why these words belong in this order when sequencing. My students will then do a think, pair, share, where they discuss with each other what they're thinking for their ideas. This will give them an opportunity to discuss their ideas out loud to one another and receive feedback. If one student is between 2 ideas, it might be great to talk with a partner, and maybe their partner will tell them which one they would be more interested in reading about, since they will be their audience. After this, my students will then return to their seats and work on a graphic organizer. I have found graphic organizers work great for my students because, as I mentioned, they have trouble sequencing their events and informal writing activities. The graphic organizer forces them to think about the sequence, and then they can add in the transition words as they go. On my third lesson, my students will have already written their graphic organizer, which is a form of their rough draft, which is a part of that process. But now we're going to talk about hooking our readers. We want our readers to want to read our writing. So what can we do to hook our readers? We'll talk about things like ideas and sound words and asking a question. I think these will be great ways for my students to apply what they're learning and kind of be introduced to the idea of a hook. And later in the year, I'll introduce them to some other ideas. But right now, I'd really just like to focus on a question or sound word to kind of hook their readers. After this, they will work on a rough draft. And at this time, I will begin meeting with my students as they're finishing up their rough drafts and taking a look at their graphic organizer and how well they transferred what they did in their graphic organizer onto their rough draft. So we will meet together and kind of work on editing their work together because my students aren't quite at that point where they can completely edit on their own. So in lesson 4, we will begin by doing peer review. My students will have the opportunity to tell a student about what they're writing about and some of their ideas. At this point, I would like my students to provide some suggestions to one another on ways they think maybe they can strengthen their writing, or maybe they might even have a question and the student could add another detail or two to make it a little clearer. This part of my lesson, I believe, will take a few days because after this, my students will kind of go back to their work and kind of review and edit it again before they take it to the computers and begin typing and publishing their work. Once they finish typing and publishing, they will then provide an illustration. This is always a really exciting part, and we work on discussing how our illustration should match what we're writing about so it gives our readers more of a visual. We've worked a lot on creating our characters and drawing people and not stick figures and really creating that background so our readers can get a visual of what we saw because we weren't all there at that moment. So what can they show us? So lesson 5 will kind of be a celebration of all of their work. All of these lessons will take some time, and I think it's really important to celebrate the accomplishment because this will not be an easy task, and it takes time to go back and revise, and at times I've found my students get discouraged when they have to go back and fix things instead of understanding that it's about making their work better. So when we're finished, we're going to celebrate, and they will just be able to present to one another and celebrate the accomplishment and enjoy each other's pieces of work. I think this unit will really help develop not only the idea of a personal narrative, but some other elements of writing as well. As I mentioned, the sequencing, ordering our events, hooking our reader with a more interesting lead. And I also really am looking forward to seeing how my students work with one another and taking that opportunity to learn from one another rather than just meeting with me.